Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, and we are a historically humanist congregation. This is Coffee and Wisdom. We've been talking for the past week about humanism and the human condition, thinking about how humanism is very much a way life within that, and how we can communicate better among ourselves and also to the larger world about humanism. And we're going to do a little bit longer form today for those who are on Zoom and who are willing. We will be asking this question a little bit later on. And if you're not interested in participating, just turn off your camera and your microphone, and we won't see you. So it's completely up to you. My question for today is, why can't humanists tell a good story? Because the fact is that the introductions to humanism are not good introductions to humanism. And this is a serious problem for humanism because people don't know what the heck it is. So, for example, Oxford has a book series called Very Short Introductions, and we have a very short introduction to humanism by Stephen Law. This is a British philosopher who wrote the book. It's quite good, but guess what? You need to be kind of aware of philosophy to even really find it very interesting, because it is looking at humanism from a historical, philosophical way of talking about it. The same is true of this book, Humanism: An Introduction by Jim Herrick. And the fact is, and this is true, humanist beliefs are almost like the common sense of large parts of the Western world today. I took this off of Humanist UK site, and it is absolutely true. Anytime people look and talk about humanism, they almost always say, oh, well, I guess I am a humanist. But, but there are very few of us who are out here saying we're humanists and trying to act like humanists in the world. So where is the disconnect? Another intro book is On Humanism from a series called Thinking in Action by Richard Norman. Guess what? It's another British book. And one thing about humanism is that it's much more popular in the UK. One reason being that the UK, the people in the UK are more oriented towards secularism already. They're already not interested in religion, and so humanism does appeal to them. So another problem is that introductions to humanism from the United Kingdom are talking about humanism in a very different way than we need to be talking about it in the United States, where people still are largely, at least say they are in some form religious. So again, why do humanists so often sound like boring Greek philosophers? Yes, you can turn even Spock and Kirk into boring Greek philosophers if you are looking at it in a particular way. And this is not what we want to be communicating. I like this, and this again is off a understandinghumanism.org.uk site saying, hey, this is what humanists believe: empathy, reason, and morality. That communicates something. It's a cute picture. And you know what? We don't have anything like that in the United States to introduce people to the idea of humanism. And again, why don't we? And, what is the disconnect? Couldn't find a good picture of this one, but there is a new book out, The Little Book of Humanism, Universal Lessons on Finding Purpose, Meaning, and Joy. But guess what? It too is British. I have a copy, but the published editions are from the UK, therefore a little bit expensive. And when will we have a US version of this? Again, don't know because they don't tend to come here until several years later, if ever at all. Alice Roberts is a very popular documentary filmmaker and scientist in England, a popularizer of scientific ideas, and she's also a humanist and helps edit the book. Andrew Copson is the CEO of Humanist UK, also a better communicator of humanism than we tend to be in the US. I'll show you a very simple fact of the matter, which is that this little book has white space. And guess what? Most introductions to humanism don't have any white space, and they certainly don't have any pictures. Again, one of the problems that we have is we don't communicate humanism in a way that most people can find in any way interesting. Well, in the US, we do have some books on humanism. One is American Religious Humanism by Mason Olds. This is out there and it is in print because it is required of you ministers in formation to read this. It is a biography of three of the early humanists, one being John Dietrich, and the senior minister of First Unitarian Society in the 1920s and 30s. One of the best books is Becoming More Fully Human, Religious Humanism as a Way of Life by William R. Murray. Bill died just a couple of years ago. I knew him quite well. He's a very good communicator about humanism. But again, he has this problem, which is that he looks at things from a philosophical viewpoint. So the book is fairly dense for people who would like to just get an introduction to what humanism is and really how to do it, how to act in the world. He was also a Unitarian Universalist minister, by the way. A book that is out there, speaking of which, is Humanist Voices in Unitarian Universalism. This is very specifically Unitarian Universalist humanism. It is edited by Kendall Gibbons, my predecessor at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis and a humanist, and William R. Murray, just before he passed on. Humanist Voices in Unitarian Universalism has a lot of younger voices in it, thankfully. I do have an essay in there, but it is, again, very specifically about Unitarian Universalist humanism. So it introduces that idea, but not the bigger idea. I'm not casting aspersions because I've tried it too. I wrote a book that's Living into Humanism After the Bloody Mary Game. I too failed. It's not a good introduction because people like Bill Murray, people like me, the problem is that we have been trained academically to understand the world through philosophical lens. So here we go. We talk in a philosophical manner. That's how we see the world. And, we've been trained to do that. And that's how we do it sort of automatically. But guess what? Most people have not had the time or interest to spend a lot of time studying philosophy, especially in universities. So it's very difficult then to really get into this kind of stuff. Also, like Bill Murray, I'm a minister of a congregation, so I don't have a great deal of time after I do sermons almost every week and that kind of thing. So we don't have a good introduction, and that's very much a problem with humanism, especially here in the United States. So how do we tell the story of humanism, Unitarian Universalist humanism? How do we get that word out into the world? And that's the question we're going to talk a little bit about today. I do want to remind you, we have a presence on YouTube and Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can help out financially at PayPal or firstunitarian.org/donate. Also, join in the Den of Conversation. This is a new YouTube channel that has all humanism all the time. It has our shorter pieces on humanism. Again, attempting to make humanism a little bit more understandable in the wider world. That is on YouTube. Just look up Den of Conversation and subscribe. Also, Assembly this Sunday, 10:30 a.m. You can see humanism in action with First Unitarian Society's assemblies on Sunday morning, 10:30 Central Time. My question this week is, what is a conscience and why would I want one? It's a fairly complex question, a little bit philosophical, but I'll try to get it to the point that we can really think about a conscience and as good citizens in the world, which is what we humanists often try to do. So thank you for joining me today, and we will be opening it up for conversation. So those of you on our Zoom call who don't want to participate, you can turn off your camera and your microphone, or you can join us here and join in if you are interested. So we will go now to Zoom. All right. Hello, everyone. All right. Well, most of you have some interest in humanism. Of course, First Unitarian Society, those of you who are within driving distance or walking distance of there, that's one way to find humanism or to be raised in it, as some of you. But have you been thinking about how do we talk about this? We're not going to go knocking on doors, but how do we do it? So, yeah, who wants to take a shot at that?
I will.
Yes, Ruth. Yes, Ruth.
David, I just want to say, or my impression is that I would give you a first prize for your very magnetic cover of your book. It really compelled the potential reader to look at it.
Yes, yes. Those of you who don't, I'm using the metaphor of the Bloody Mary game. I don't know how many of you know it, but it's a pajama party game that kids play. Is that you light candles and close a bathroom door, turn on the faucet, and go, where is your baby Bloody Mary, and you spin her 3 times, and then look in the mirror, and you see Mary in the mirror. But of course, you actually don't. You have merely created that in your own mind, which is my idea about most supernatural. That's the metaphor, is we create most of this in the human mind. So, yeah. But again, one of the problems with the book is it's published by an academic publisher because it has all these footnotes, which I do in my talks. So it's a very expensive book because it's academic. It's not a pulp book like this little fellow here. So that's another of our problems, actually. But thank you, Ruth. Thank you. I had nothing to do with the cover, but I did do the title, so. Yes. Is to communicate humanism better. Have you been trying to tell your cousin or someone in the street or?
Mark, do you have something to say?
Well, I do. I read after the Bloody Mary game, and I did not think it was at all overly philosophical. It was. I thought it was a good read. It absorbed my interest and all that. I definitely don't think it was overly philosophical, but don't we have to have some kind of a philosophical base? I think it's inevitable. Any religious stance, any humanistic stance, it has to have a philosophical base, and it has to underlie, and I think it has to be discussed in just about any book. I don't think you can avoid it. And why would you want to avoid it? I'm kind of just asking this as an open question.
Yes, yeah. Well, yes, and thank you, Mark, for saying that about the book. One of our disadvantages is that our background is not as well known. In the United States, especially, when somebody walks up to you and talks about Christianity, I mean, you grew up Christian, I grew up Christian, many you humanists grew up Christian. So we already know so much of the backstory, right, that we don't even need to footnote it. It's all there, the life of Jesus and all about the disciples and all about the difference between Roman Catholics and Protestants and, Presbyterians and Southern Baptists. We have so many cultural, footnotes here. And actually, humanism doesn't have so much, right? That's one of our problems. Yes, Bernadine, yeah.
What really resonated with me, David, this morning was the quote you shared about a lot of the fundamental beliefs and principles of humanism just sound like common sense and are so infused throughout our culture. So as an example, in the work that I do, we had to come up with some principles I like to think of them as design principles that inform our approach. And the first design principle I lifted from FUS's covenant about we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. And I just put that right out there, and I didn't tell anybody it was the FUS principle because it's so universally helpful. And our Constitution, I think you see a lot of humanist principles that have been embraced, but they're just not understood to be part of a worldview that is non-theistic and supernatural.
Yeah.
That's a very, very good point. And, you know, that one comes into Unitarian Universalism specifically out of humanism. The inherent worth and dignity of every person is not a Christian concept, right? It is a humanist concept. Paul, were you going to say?
Yeah, there's a question of what turf we're playing on. So much of the kind of general conversation gets to be, you know, well, is there a God or not? And that really isn't, I think, the most important part of humanism. We have our point of view and all of that, but as long as we're caught up in this atheist or non-atheist stuff, that kind of overshadows what we could be saying. And again, it's not our turf. We have to have our own and let that be.
Well, you know, that's a very good point, Paul. And you know, one of the differences between United Kingdom humanism and U.S. humanism is the majority of people in the UK are already agnostic atheists, right? They're just not worried about religion. They've left it. Their parents probably left it, maybe even their grandparents. So it's just not an issue in the United Kingdom for the majority of the population. Whereas here in the U.S., we still have a huge number of people who are theists and vaguely Christian, right? In some kind of, you know, just sort of cultural way, because, hey, guess what's coming up? Thanksgiving and then Christmas, right? I mean, the U.S. is just imbued with, you know, with the Christian story. And so we still, the fact that we set up often there's something about you have to be agnostic and atheist is a turnoff to a vast number of Americans. And yes, I do not agree that is an absolute requirement in any way, shape, or form. As I always say, all you really need to believe is in human agency, and humans fix their own problems. And evangelical Christians don't, right? They just don't think so. So, you know.
Wow, that is so interesting, because I really disagree in the sense that in my own self-identity as a humanist, to me, foundational is this idea of supernatural, that we rely on reason and science. To me, that is as core as a humanist, my own identity as a humanist, as the idea of human agency.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, yes. And most of us who have lived in it for some time have come to that, right? You know, after you let go.
Yeah. My point was more that we shouldn't get caught in arguing about God all the time. You know, I agree with Bernardine, but if the argument is simply atheism or not, then we're really kind of off topic. That's somebody else's argument.
Well, and all three of the British intros that I mentioned have chapters about arguments against the existence of God, right? Which, you know, does interest some people, but not everybody. So, yeah. Mark, you're going to say?
I grew up Roman Catholic during the 1950s and early 60s. And although the church was the gateway to heaven, absolutely the gateway to heaven, the human problems, it was inculcated to us from being 5 years old. Human problems are solved by humans. I mean, that was strong teaching. So that part is very, very humanistic. The difference is that doesn't get you to heaven. The church, through the priest and the hierarchy, gets you to heaven. But human problems are solved by humans.
Well, and William James, when he talks about American religion, he makes that distinction that the Roman Catholics among Americans do believe in working on a social gospel, right? Actually fixing the world, you know, the Catholic workers' homes and that kind of thing, right? And that's one of the distinctions that he makes between Roman Catholics and Protestants. It's not entirely true, because the social gospel movement did take root in mainline Christianity, and that's one of the reasons, one of the arguments for the reason that it has declined so rapidly, is that Americans don't want their religion involved in politics, right? So, you know, it is complicated. Yeah. Yes, Bruce.
So something occurs to me, and maybe this relates or maybe not, but one of the press commentators after last night's town hall meetings was discussing that historically, the press has always been just very certain to present both sides of the argument. You know, you got to present, if there's one side, you got to present the other side. And the comment was made that, you know, in today's reality, we should really be thinking about changing that rather than issuing both arguments on both sides of it. We should really be discussing one, democracy, and two, demonstrable fact. So a really radical departure from both sides of whichever argument, but rather, you know, how does this discussion, this argument relate to democracy, and how does it relate to demonstrable fact?
Yeah, well, yes, that's a very good idea. I mean, I think, you know, one of our ideals is some kind of civil society in which people civilly and rationally talk about ideas, and that's the way toward a form of civil society and democracy. And as the religious poles have, you know, there's a chasm now between the right and the left, and politically within congregations themselves. And we've seen that in the Presbyterians over GLBTQ issues. You know, it's just split in left and right. United Methodism is in the process of splitting left and right. And what that will mean for people is that the people who go to those congregations will now only hear right or left, right? They won't hear anything in between. So maybe one position that humanists can fill would be that idea that we are actually going to think about ideas, even ones we don't agree with, right? But in our present political environment, that's not easy, right? That's not easy in terms of, because we are committed to certain values that we really can't let go of in our minds. So it's very complicated, very, very complicated. But yeah, Kim.
First of all, I just wanted to report that it's snowing in Anoka.
Oh boy. Well, welcome to Minnesota.
So I attended the virtual humanist conference, the National Humanist Conference a few weeks back. Yeah. And they recommended this book as sort of a good introduction to humanism. Mm-hmm. And what do you think?
That was by the president of the American Humanist Association, Creating Change Through Humanism. Yes, I like it, but one of the problems with this way of thinking is that it is only dealing with essentially one aspect of humanism, which is the separation of church and state. I have a meeting with Roy in about an hour. So, I mean, I know him well and love the guy. But the American Humanist Association has thrown its money on the wheel of protecting the separation between church and state. That's it's absolutely critical to save our democracy. I would agree. But it doesn't approach the ideas of what do we do about the vast discrepancies between Black and brown people and the American white supremacy culture that we that we live in, and that kind of thing. So it's addressing a very privileged, educated white, right? I mean, so that's one thing, even though it's absolutely, utterly important.
Yeah, David, I think all the comments prior to you speaking, I think it's been wonderful, because I think, at least from my observation, is pointing to that reality of power, and how is power distributed in the kind of work that we're trying to do, right? I mean, from my opinion, I don't think, depending on where you are located, right, I think the access to some level of education, literature, and so on and so forth, allows you to some extent develop a notion of reason, rationality, scientific inquiry, dot, 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 dot. However, when you step outside of the comfort and security of whatever you consider your home, if you have the privilege of having a stable home, what happens? And I think that, at least for me, has been one of the issues that I've struggled within humanism, right? Is when you choose, or humanisms, right? Because it's not just one, we would have to contextualize. But once you make the decision of saying, well, I no longer believe X, Y, and Z, right? Which could lead to the severance of relationships, losing financial, emotional, psychological support, so on and so forth. Who is there to support me through the process, right? So how are those values and principles then embodied? Mm-hmm. And so I find that it is really easy to say, well, you know, as a humanist, we believe these core principles. The same thing for Unitarian Universalism, where we believe all these things. And it sounds beautiful. I mean, the aspirations are incredible. Who wouldn't want to embrace these principles or values, right? But in the praxis, what happens?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, what are we really doing as humanists, free thinkers, agnostics, and so forth, in order to really show some form of collective work and liberation that's being done?
Right. Well, and I mean, that's, you know, one of the friends of FUS and humanism is Mandisa Thomas of Black Nonbelievers. And so, I mean, what she said that she has to have a separate organization because the social location of so many African Americans is such that leaving the Black church tradition means absolutely exiting all of your support systems, right? So people stay within the system just because they have to, right? Because there are no other systems to take care of your needs. You don't have a social circle anymore if you leave the Black church. But some people feel compelled to do it, and that's what Black Nonbelievers is there for, is that kind of support. So yeah, I think part of the answer is humanisms, right? Yes, as you said, that we have to look at different social locations and what different social locations, different kinds of oppressions mean in terms of what humanism is. And then what's the message of humanism again? Is it freedom from dogma, Christian dogma or religious dogma, or is it freedom to think in very new ways about all kinds of stuff, not just the kind of traditional Christian religion, but what about politics? What about the questions of oppression? What about the questions of economics, right? Because as I've said before, I mean, the Humanist Manifesto comes directly out of democratic socialist values. That's built into the whole system of understanding a shared life and a shared world. Well, that's not even in the American Humanist Association manifestos anymore. That has now disappeared. Well, what does that mean that it has disappeared? What does it mean when you work 3 different jobs and have no health insurance, that you're talking about how to flourish in life better? What does that even mean? And these are all valid questions. As we look at these things, absolutely, we have to look at the fact that many Americans are living in a place of absolute desperation economically, right? And the separation of church and state is completely important to the whole idea of America. But is it important to the person who suddenly has a $70,000 health bill because of no insurance, and you're going to lose your house and your car and everything you've ever worked for? So yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, I think. Again, there's a better social safety net in the UK as well. Yeah, Bernadine. Yeah.
So interesting. Thank you, Anthony, for your reflections, and I really appreciate the lens you bring about how humanism, what implications it has in how we live, our lived experience today. But just now, you talked about how some core values of humanism come out of democratic socialism, say these have a common shared fate. And I think the biggest pain for me in American life today is the shrinking of the public sphere and how we privatized everything and sort of turning the idea of being members of society into being consumers, and the transactionalization really of our citizenship. And I'm wondering if humanism has a role to play there, if that's part of why we can't be part of the problem, is because we pull from this communitarian idea of a shared connection that is so anti-American in a sense.
Yeah. Go ahead, Anthony. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that, Bernardine, thank you so much for expanding on that question. I think that I would add that, yes, I think humanism definitely has a role to play. But again, it would bring back the dialogue and conversation around what humanism are we promoting, right? Because like Dr. Juan Thomas Floyd mentions in his book, The Origin of Black Humanism, right? He says, for example, the experience of humanists that come from an Afro-Caribbean or just the Caribbean experience and decide to embrace some form of humanism, that humanism in itself is not a transference of European humanism, right? It brings and carries its own life, let's say that, and life in the summary of the holistic understanding of what makes us human. And so if we begin to then look at that particular definition, then it is possible to change our notion of social participation, right, from a vertical understanding to a more horizontal, right? And so that's why I think that, yes, humanism has a lot to offer if, like Dr. Beaton mentioned, we began to really embody and practice the notion of shared community, right? And I mean, it's hard to do because that means that you're putting, maybe not in jeopardy, but you're being more conscious of how am I putting ... in the line to then make the shared community or communities more equitable. Right? So it takes that notion of, let me not do charity and let me then do actions that push us towards justice. And I think that might be the psychosocial discrepancy between that thing of like, well, when we were believers or whatever, we did this and we're done, right? I donate to my favorite places that are doing things that I kind of align with, and then I'm done. Or am I going above and beyond as I'm able and in accordance to what I'm able to really do, right? Not everybody has economic power, whatever, but you might have education or you might just have your presence, right? Like, so whatever way you're able to accompany and be in solidarity, I think that that's one of the ways that we can begin to show up in ways that demonstrate to other people that humanism, again, is not just, like I love to say, an intellectual exercise, but it's really showing up in the lives of others.
Right. Well, and back to Mark's point, and I very specifically said, why do humanists sound like boring Greek philosophers? One of our mistakes, I think, too, is to enter this conversation through the ideas of boring Greek philosophers, right? The gateway into a communitarian understanding of humanism may not be through Plato, may not be through Socrates. It may be a very different way of communicating. I see Ruth here on their screen, who's still living her life as a social worker, dedicated social worker. The whole idea of getting into people's lives and actually helping them, not, and Ruth is still getting in people's lives and actually helping them, right? And if everyone were like a dedicated social worker, then we would have a very different kind of humanism, probably, right? So.
David, but you overcredit me. I know.
Humbleness is another side of engaged activity in the world. I think it makes you humble. So
I just love that idea of the shared community. I think that's a really, really good concept and something we could use.
yeah, it was in the first Humanist Manifesto in 1933, and it dropped out of the second one. They of course, you know, after the Second World War and after McCarthyism, humanists really got scared of being called red atheists, right? You know, Marxist atheists, and so there was a backing away from economic commitments at that time for social reasons, right? For social reasons, it doesn't, you know, sort of the marginalization of liberals that occurred in the 1960s, you know, the very much liberal, the Great Society liberals that were marginalized in the 1960s played into that as well, right? So that we were embarrassed, you know, nationally as a, you know, to even be talking about the kinds of things we actually believe in, right? So, which is a great loss, but, you know. David.
Community, and I like the language beloved community. Peter Block talks about that, and it sort of, that almost is like an attempt to capture that sense of meaning and purpose, right? To take because beloved is often a word we use for things of veneration. So, and community really is at the center of our humanity. So I think that beloved community language is a very powerful one for us.
Right. Well, and Martin Luther King very particularly chose to say that instead of kingdom of God, which is the liberal Christian view of creating the kingdom of God on earth. And of course, that's what Mark was talking about with Roman Catholics, that we can build the kingdom of God on earth, and that would be the beloved community. But King was smart enough to know, well, wait a minute, that's Christian. Let's move that over here so that we're also talking to other people, Muslims, you know, and atheists, etc. So yeah. Yeah, we need to watch our language. Really, we do. Yeah, Marlene. Yeah.
I've probably mentioned this before, but I did take classes at United Theological Seminary. And one I really appreciated was the Native American spirituality, where the first day our instructor said, I'm not going to give the prayer every week, so I'm going to pass this around and you all sign up for doing the prayer. And then she said, and I'm not going to do the talk every day. So I'm going to send this around and you can all talk. And I think she helped with topics, but the sharing and that everybody's opinion and thoughts and ideas were open to the whole room was really very interesting.
Yeah. Well, yes. Well, and that's decentering, right? Decentering the authority, right? And that's very much part of what humanism is about, right? Because we don't believe that the minister has any telephone line to God or the truth or anything like that. We just don't believe it. So the position of anybody within the community is that we all have valid ideas, right? And that's important. And we forget it. You know, it's too easy to put everything on some high level leader in an organization and forget to ask people. And I'm as guilty as anybody because you get busy, right? So, but yeah, very good. Yeah, Marcy. Well, we should sign off. We've got some people who need to leave. Thank you all for joining in conversation today. And always enjoy talking. And I'm always inviting someone to be out there talking about humanism in a new way. And I'm always inviting some of our Meadville students and others to reimagine humanism and write that introduction that doesn't sound like boring Greek philosophers. Let's make Captain Kirk and Spock into people, sci-fi instead of boring Greek philosophers. So thank you all. Monday or on Sunday.